Welcome. Today we're talking about cybersecurity, which is an episode I've been really looking forward to because, in some ways, it's the elephant in the room when you're talking about AI adoption. Joining us to unpack this topic is an old friend of mine, Tom Burton, who is a cybersecurity and national security strategist. Tom has been working in the field for over 20 years across government, defence, and critical national infrastructure. He's an advisor to the UK government and a regular speaker on AI. He's also ex-military, where he was involved in advancing technology in his regiment and particularly focusing on risk and opportunity, finishing at the rank of major. So from here on in, we need to refer to you as Major Tom.
Hopefully in a space oddity rather than an ashes to ashes context.
So coming at the topic of AI and cyber, I've got my own kind of coming in hypothesis, Tom, that I wondered if you could help me understand. Um, I see the mid market FTSE 250 as a sector that is increasingly vulnerable to cyber, um, partially because they are big enough to have the financial resources to respond to any ransomware threats. So they're considered to be an important target. But also, they're that small that they don't necessarily have an army of their own cybersecurity experts, and their defenses might be a little bit lower than, say, the FTSE 250. Now, as we look at the environment that's starting to build out there, um, I think we're seeing more and more AI supported cyber intrusions. And I'm wondering if the risk to those mid market companies is starting to increase even further. So, Tom, I wonder if we could start by getting you to help us understand the cyber threat faced by that mid market and understand some of the ways in which that's developing.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. So coming to your just briefly coming to your hypothesis, I completely agree, and I think that actually what I've seen and what governments have seen over the last decade bears that out in evidence. That 10, 15 years ago, organizations would have, in the mid-market, would have gone, who's going to know about me? Who's going to attack me? I haven't got anything of any material. They were essentially relying on hiding in plain sight. And that situation has changed. And it's changed partly because of advances in AI and the technologies that the attackers are using on two folds. First of all, they're now using technology to scour the entire internet to identify organizations that have a presence and have vulnerabilities. And it doesn't matter whether you're a mum and pop shop on the high street, whether you're a mid-market organization scaling up and trying to fight it out with the big guys, or whether you're a Marks and Spencer's or a Jaguar Land Rover. If you have a vulnerability, you can be found by technology, and that technology will then execute against that vulnerability, no matter how big or how small you are. So that's one aspect. The other aspect where AI is playing a part in the increase effectiveness of attacks is around social engineering. So the bad guys, the threat groups, are essentially using AI to craft the most believable and authentic spear-phishing emails you can imagine. But the days of being able to read an email and immediately spot that it was written by somebody who your language isn't their first language, who doesn't really understand much of it about your business, is no longer the case. Not only that, it's not just the emails, it's the voicemails, it's the video conferences, it's the deepfake video. And we saw an organization where they were hoodwinked on a conference call where their CFO was requesting a transfer of, I think it was about $10 or $15 million to another account, only it wasn't their CFO. It was somebody with a deepfake representation of the CFO, and they'd also backed it up with other people on the call, who were playing supporting roles who were also deepfake members of the organisation.
Yeah, I've actually seen that too, and it's really interesting. Is they will scrape your social media for all your voice, right, across Instagram, TikTok. So if you do reels, and you think you're doing it to friends or family, but actually what you're doing is giving your voice signature out to the internet. So if you are an executive or a place who holds privileged access within the business, actually people don't think about videos that they post of themselves with their kids talking, or then actually how replicatable your identity or your voice and even your likeness can actually be copied.
I think that's a really interesting point. And the immediate, people assume that the immediate reaction from people in the security world will be, therefore you mustn't post videos of yourself on TikTok. The cat is out of the bag. It's a bit like saying you mustn't tell anyone your mother's maiden name. That piece of information has gone. Your voice has gone. What it requires is for people to be questioning the believability of things, and to have side channels open so that they can verify. If you receive a voicemail, then reach out to the person via WhatsApp to make sure it's them. Yeah.
That's probably certain, man. But if it's situational awareness, it's probably more prep as to what's the source, what's the timing, the likelihood, and believability. Right? Is this a normal behaviour for the person that you know?
Yes.
So if it is a CFO or it is a privileged person in business, do I usually, it's what else that person usually connect with me? It's like, do we do enough education? It's
I don't think we do. And it's not just the security side of things, it's also actually the topic of AI, which we're here to talk about. There is, and it's something I first noticed when I was in the military and driving digital transformation across the armoured division over in Germany. The fact that it is a human weakness, we're more likely to believe what technology tells us than what a carbon life form tells us. And it's utterly bizarre. I mean, but as a result of that, we take at face value the emails we receive, the requests that we receive on social media and things like that, in ways that we simply wouldn't if somebody knocked on our door.
So, Tom, coming back to what you said a few minutes ago on spear-phishing, can you help us understand how some of those cyber attacks develop and what the motivations ultimately are for them?
And that's a really good question, because we refer to cyber attacks as a general term, but we're often referring to different things. So let's start off about what the motivations are. And 90% of the cyber attacks that most businesses need to be concerned about are motivated in only one thing, and that is money. Organized crime just wants to make a fast buck. And they'll use whatever lever they can to remove that money from your pocket. So one common thing is business email compromise. Essentially, it's somebody pretending to be the CFO or the CEO, pretending in quite a convincing and believable way in order to encourage somebody else in the business to transfer some money over.
Yeah.
Simple as that. It's fraud via digital technology, and it's no more complicated than that. As we know, another side of cyber attack that is becoming increasingly common is ransomware. And again, all that relates to is cyber attackers wanting to cause as much pain to you and your business as possible in order to incentivize you to pay them to get off your back. And it's no more complex than that. However, if we look at how ransomware attacks have evolved over the last couple of years, the way they apply that leverage has changed as they've found additional ways to apply even more pain to you in order to increase their chances that you're going to pay the ransom. So whereas 5 years ago, they'd lock up all your data and they'd ask you to pay them a king's ransom in order to unlock it. And that worked fine. And they got a lot of money for it. But then businesses went, well, actually, all we need to do is make sure that we've got a backup of all our data, and we won't have to pay the ransom. So now they lock up your data, try and ransom to unlock it. But before they lock it up, they've stolen it as well. So if you say, haha, I'm not going to pay the ransom because I've got a backup, they say, doesn't matter. I've got your data too. So unless you pay me, I'm going to sell that data and release it in the public. So that's play 2. Play 3 is, and you're going to be really embarrassed when I do that in a very, very, very public way. So you're going to have to pay me to protect your reputation. But they're now using a 4th play as well. If none of those work, or perhaps actually even if they do work so that they can get more money, they've stolen the data, they'll now go after the people that data relates to in order to try and ransom them to prevent them using that data to cause them harm. So that's sort of how they're evolving. Coming back to the start of your question, though, the social engineering, the spear-phishing, that's a part of an attack. It's not an attack in its own right. That relates to them trying to get an entry point. And in order to cause harm, they need to get into your environment, into your systems. One of the most frequent ways they'll do that is to try and exploit one of the people that you have who are allowed to use your systems. And that's where the spear-phishing, the deepfakes, the social engineering comes in. It's exploiting the vulnerability that sits 9 inches away from their computer screen every day and has far too many things on their mind to always be foolproof in spotting a suspicious email or spotting a phone call that's coming from a number that they don't recognize.
So essentially, AI is making that spear phishing process much easier and more effective by virtue of the information that they can scrape off public domain and then replay to fool the humans into allowing access.
Yes, and also much cheaper because technology is doing what 10 years ago a human being would have done, and organized crime is capitalist tooth and claw. They want the minimum investment to deliver the maximum return. And so they're using AI now instead of using people. They're using AI to drive efficiency through their business, which means that because they've lowered the transaction cost, they've lowered the investment, they can scale that up and attack an order of magnitude more organizations, which comes back to your original hypothesis. They no longer need to focus their bets on a few large businesses. They can now spread their bets across any business that has vulnerabilities because they've got technology helping them.
So how should businesses be preparing for that eventuality? You've said already that they can't assume that they're going to be anonymous anymore. They should assume that at some point there will be an attempt to penetrate them through whatever means. So how should businesses prepare for that attempt in advance?
So, and that's quite a big question with many facets. The one I'd start off with is actually a piece of good news. Yes, everyone is now at threat, under threat, and it's not just the mid-market, it goes down to the SMEs as well. The good news is, and again, it comes back to the fact that the bad guys are wanting maximum return for minimum investment. You only have to be a bit better than average in order to significantly reduce the chances that they'll be successful. Because if they knock on the door and it's locked and they can't get in, they'll just go down the street to a door because they know they'll come across a door that isn't locked. So actually getting your security program in order, starting to implement some of the controls that exist in our NCSC's Cyber Essentials standard. It's not foolproof. It won't prevent a really determined attacker, but it'll prevent about 90 to 95% of the opportunists. And that came out in the National Cybersecurity Centre's annual report. They pointed out that the majority of attacks that they had seen over the previous 12 months would have been prevented with basic hygiene.
And what is that basic hygiene? Help us understand what some of those controls are and how you can train and coach your people to adopt those controls and to be on their guard against spear phishing.
Phew, that's a big topic in its own right, but I'll try and unpick a couple of the most frequent ones that tend not to be there. So the obvious ones that usually are there is you need to have a firewall to stop somebody getting into your machines. But most people have that because it's switched on by default anyway. It's most of the areas that businesses struggle with, though, are making sure they've done due diligence over the suppliers that they're dealing with, making sure that their suppliers have adequate security before they either allow their supplier to plug into them or before they hand over sensitive information. And it's not consistently done very well because it's hard, because you don't have direct visibility of your suppliers and you've got to ask all sorts of awkward personal questions at a time when you're trying to build a trusting relationship. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is recognizing that when you control what your people can do, it's not because you don't trust your people, it's because human beings are fallible, and therefore it makes no sense to give somebody access to something sensitive unless they need it in order to do their job. So controlling who has access to what isn't about whether you trust your employees, it's just about good common business sense. Because if everyone has access to everything, then the bad guys only need to find a weakness in one person and they can unpick the entire business. Which then comes on to the third aspect, which is making sure that your systems are separated from each other. So that if, for instance, your ERP is compromised, that they can't immediately move from your ERP system onto all of your other systems. The final piece, I would say, which is a common area of weakness, because it's a really attractive proposition for businesses. Over the last decade, we've seen massive rise in things like allowing people to access their business anywhere, particularly over COVID. Suddenly we had to give people access. And the idea of being able to use your own device to access corporate resources, access business, do business was really attractive. During COVID, actually, in many cases, it was a necessity. The problem is that if you're not managing the laptop that they're using, you have absolutely no control over the defenses and the security of that laptop. And therefore, you have to assume that that laptop is riddled with malware or is at the very least vulnerable. So whilst enabling your staff to be able to use their own devices to do business may be attractive, you need to think what the consequences will be if that device ends up being the back door into your business.
Okay. And it sounds like you're starting off from the premise that there's a certain inevitability around cyber intrusions, and at some point somebody is going to get into your network for whatever purpose. So you need to then plan for that scenario where you have been penetrated by a cyber attacker. And so I guess also there's a sort of human organizational behavioral aspect of wargaming. What happens when that does occur, and does everybody know their roles and how to respond?
That's a really good point, and that's something that came out in the NCSC's annual report this year, making the point that just focusing on preventing an attack is no longer enough. Operating on the assumption that a compromise is inevitable, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean it'll definitely happen, but you need to work on the assumption that it quite possibly will happen, and therefore how will you be able to make sure your business can continue operating and can recover in that inevitability. And that's about moving it from risk, I need to reduce the probability that that will happen, to resilience, what happens when that does happen, and how do I make sure that I'm able to ride with the punches? So that's one aspect of that, is making sure that if somebody knocks down one part of your business, that you've got fire breaks in place to prevent things spreading too much, so that you can continue. But you're quite right. Wargaming, practicing, rehearsing, exercising, far better to get that muscle memory in place when it's not a crisis, so that it becomes natural when the crisis arises.
Yeah. So all of these points sound like great cybersecurity fundamentals. Should we drill in a little bit more to how the phenomenon of AI affects all of this? You talked a bit already about spear-phishing. And I've seen in the news this last week an article, it might be hyperbole, but the article is about Anthropic uncovering the first AI-led cyber attack. So is there more that's happening in terms of attempts? And then on the other side of the fence, you've got organizations now that are starting to explore and embrace AI. So people within those organizations are firing up all of their own tools, and there's lots of shadow AI happening where people are maybe sharing data that they shouldn't really be sharing with AI tools that are outside of their corporate network. So can you tell us a little bit more about how AI is changing this game beyond spear-phishing?
Yeah. And it's interesting because there have been various reports about autonomous malware that just goes out there and destroys everything. So most of the reports I've read are the results of research projects, so they're proofs of concept. So I haven't seen any reports of truly autonomous that doesn't require a hacker on the other end and just goes in there and attacks. That probably will happen at some stage in the future, because that's just the evolution of technology. But that's not something I think that is a clear and present risk today. AI is used in elements of it, but that matrix style autonomous bad agent is still, thankfully, the work of science fiction. But coming back to your question, businesses, as we know, are trying to work out how to use AI in order to drive efficiency and in order to improve their profitability and their scale. And some of them are doing that formally. Some of them, well-intended employees within the business, are seeing a way that they can do something faster, easier, and with less effort. So whereas previously we had shadow IT, now we absolutely have elements of shadow AI. In terms of risk, I think that we need to look at this fairly broadly, though. And many of the organisations I've been helping in this case, it's what we've been doing. At first sight, yes, we need to worry about what information we're giving to the AI, or what information the AI has access to, and what the risk is that sensitive information that the AI is handling might get out. That's no different to information security that we've been dealing with all along. But I think it goes broader than that when we're talking about AI governance in the round. It's not just about, do we trust the AI to handle the information? It's also about, how much can we trust the AI to correctly interpret that information and to come up with conclusions that are safe for the business. So it's not just, is the information secure? Is the decision that the agent is making consistent and secure? What are the risks associated with hallucination, with model bias, with model collapse, when we're looking at the business outcome that we're trying to drive?
Yeah, that's interesting. Can I jump in there? Of course, yeah. So just role play with me. So obviously, I'm an executive sitting on a board, and AI is probably not the concern for us today, because we're using it for data analytics, right? Most businesses aren't in a fundamental place where AI is decision making. However, we are playing around with agents, right? Whether they're unattended agents or whether they're fully attended agents. The NCA or traditional security frameworks is all around humans and controls. Whereas if we actually do start deploying orchestrated agents at scale, right, who do have some autonomous capability, self-healing, and some level of decision making, we do actually throw a lot of that rulebook out the window, right? Because at the moment, businesses are throwing those rulebooks out of the window because they want to experiment, right? They want to be able to advance their operating model. They want to be able to advance and have some type of competitive advantage, so they're leveraging it. If I'm an executive in a FTSE 250 or FTSE 100, or actually any business today, what questions should I be asking myself and of the rest of my peers around how we're allowing this to propagate through the business? What should we be doing to make sure that we're putting guardrails in place to protect our autonomy or the autonomous agents out in the business, and actually who has control of those agents, right? Because we do give those agents privileged access. Even though we think they're tools, we are giving them privileged access so they can go and do the things that we want them to go and do, rather than the humans.
And this is a topic I find absolutely fascinating, and it comes back to our weaknesses as human beings in the way we treat and our relationship with technology. The AI that we're seeing emerging and we're trying to use at the moment, there are some fundamentals. One is it's not predictable. It's non-deterministic. In fact, even the people designing it don't truly understand and can't predict where it's going to go. So let's take that as a given. The way I see it is that sounds very much like a human being. I'm not suggesting that AI is conscious or AI, but in terms of the way it behaves, it is more like a human than it is like a piece of software that we might have installed 10 years ago. Now, the good news is that we've got all of the tools in our tool bag to control risk associated with people. We apply segregation of duties to make sure that one person doesn't have too many powers and therefore a lone wolf could go off and do serious harm. We also vet people before we employ them in order to, if we want to put them into a senior position. And the level of vetting depends on the level of risk of the context that we're putting them into. Even when we've recruited them after doing that due diligence, we also tend to have probationary periods where we apply more oversight to make sure that they warrant that trust. We build trust on a progressive stage. But I think at the moment, too often we're treating the AI tools that we're implementing more like a piece of software, because it is a piece of software, rather than like a person. If we're talking about agentic AI, you say, well, we're giving them privileged access. Well, are we? Do they need that privileged access? What outcome are we trying to achieve? What do they need in order to deliver that outcome? And what controls do we need to put around an agent in order to limit its sprawl just to that outcome? And that I'd extend that not just to the controls we put around the agent. As we move into a multi-agentic situation, we also need to apply controls that restrict which agents another agent is able to communicate with, introducing those segregation of duties in order to prevent them essentially inadvertently, accidentally ganging up on the business and delivering an outcome.
Which is really, 100%. You're talking about modularization, really, of containerizing different parts of process. So only one bit of the agent can only do one element of authority, for example.
Because they are, and coming back to your point about have we got autonomous matrix agent attackers out there? No, we don't. But what we have got is enough evidence of the unpredictability. So there was a research project done about a year ago that without any prompting, they set a number of the AI tools, DeepSeek, ChatGPT, and others, to play a game of chess against the world's most advanced chess program. And most of the models, on a number of iterations, when they were monitoring the stream of consciousness, because it was it's peer-reviewed university program, the AI cheated in order to beat the chess program. And its stream of consciousness justified this by saying, I have been told to beat the world's most advanced chess program. I have not been told I have to obey the rules. And essentially, it hacked. There wasn't tight security there. It was in an environment that was designed to see whether it would be motivated to, but it basically moved the chess pieces around the board in order to be able to beat the chess program.
Interesting.
Fair.
So are boards of organizations in the mid-market especially doing enough on cyber? And if not, what else do you think they need to do based on what you've seen of these types of businesses?
So I think that there is definitely more that should be done. It's a bit of a mixed bag. You see some organizations take it seriously. You see some organizations that are a little bit more optimism biased, a little bit more hopeful. I would say that the most frequent misconception is still that it'll probably never happen to us. We're probably okay. And they probably will be okay until they're not okay, and then it's too late. Where I'm seeing change, and I think this is going to happen far faster over the coming years than it has over the last decade, is pressure applied down the supply chain to improve security. I'm seeing more businesses in the mid-market and below recognizing they probably need to get cyber essentials. Previously, that would have been because they want to do business with government. Now they're thinking, I need to have something that I can show that proves that I do actually take security seriously, whether that's cyber essentials, whether that's ISO 27001, some sort of independent badge that says, I take this seriously and therefore you can trust me.
Do you think 42,001 or the EU AI Act is achievable or attainable for a mid-market business?
Sorry.
No, that's a good question. So I won't comment on specifics because I'm not an expert enough in that legislation and the
Pack what that means.
Yeah.
For those people.
Yeah.
2001 is, I mean,
So 42,001 is a standard for good governance in AI. So it's, more people might be from.
It's the same as 27,001. It's a series of checks and balances. You as a business highlight what's relevant to you, and then do you meet those controls? But it's extensive.
It is. And the EU AI Act, and that seems to be a movable feast at the moment anyway. There seems to be much speculation that it's being watered down largely as a result of pressure from across the pond. But let's stay on the ISO standard. The problem is that standards create an industry all of their own, and that industry is motivated to make it really complicated. So you need to get external advice in to help you build it. I'm a bit more of a pragmatist. I think that the first stage is to open your eyes to what the risks are and put in place the governance, just in your own self-interest, put in place the governance that makes sure that you understand the risks and you're taking a reasonably proportionate approach to managing those risks down. And if you do that, then when a customer demands that you have met an external certification, you'll be a long way on the way to achieving those standards, because actually the ISOs are just the application of good practice. It doesn't necessarily need to be a huge challenge. Where it becomes a huge challenge is organizations do nothing and their business starts in 27001 starts adopting technologies without governance in AI. They start adopting AI without governance, and they build up so much risk before they need to do something about it that they've got a mountain to climb rather than a few checks to make sure that they're adopting good practice. So the sooner you get on the journey to implementing governance, managing risk, the easier it'll be, because you'll start small and you'll grow as adoption proceeds.
Okay, so Tom, thinking about the question in a slightly different way, is if I'm a chairman or a PE investor looking at a company, what are the signals I look for quickly to understand whether that company is managing its cyber risk appropriately? You talked a bit about cyber essentials and ISO, but what are the other quick indicators that would give me that kind of comfort factor that they're aware of the cyber risks and they're appropriately managing the risk and perhaps are preparing themselves for intrusions if and when they do occur?
So that's a really good question. I think the first one I would be asking a chairman is who on the board is accountable for this, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be a supreme expert at cybersecurity, but somebody needs to own this problem, because otherwise it'll just get swept under the carpet. It'll get ignored. It's not a big enough worry for today. And then I would probably sit down with that person on the board who is accountable, assuming that they've been appointed, and I'd start asking them how it is that they're able to sleep well at night. In other words, what is their appreciation of the risks? What bad things could happen? Because it's one thing for somebody to be accountable, but they therefore should be motivated to understand what the risks are, and they should be able to point to the people in the business who are taking responsibility, that they're satisfied they're taking sufficient responsibility that they can sleep well at night. And it's nothing about checking whether they've got security controls in place. It's more about where is the governance, where is the ownership, where is the understanding of risk. And if those things are in place, then we can start going, okay, so we now have the governance in place. How are the controls? How are the controls operating, and how are we making sure that risk is managed to an appropriate level?
So does that mean you're looking for companies to have dedicated CISOs on the main board?
I don't think it is necessary for the CISO to be on the main board, and I think it's a cry. 20 years ago, it was the CIO should be on the main board, and you go, well, that's why. Come up with a justification of why, by all means, but I don't think that's the most important thing. The board should have somebody who is accountable, as I said, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the CISO. Do all organizations need a CISO? And again, I think it's easy to get hung up on labels. Every business these days does need somebody with adequate expertise and experience to be able to lead the management of cyber risk and the implementation of security. Now, the challenge that many mid-market businesses have is, well, I don't really need somebody full-time, and I don't really want to spend the money on getting somebody full-time. And they can go in two different directions. My recommended direction would be you need to have a bit of somebody with all of the experience and expertise that you need. In other words, a fractional CISO who it has enough of a heartbeat contact with the business to know what's going on in the business, to understand the context, understand the hopes and the fears, and be able to apply the leadership and advice. The other direction a business frequently goes in is, well, we don't need a full-time CISO, but what we'll do is we'll get a full-time security manager. We'll get a lot of something cheap rather than a little bit of something expensive. And the challenge there is that they may not have the expertise, they may not have the experience, they also may not have the gravitas and the leadership qualities to be able to engage with the business. And the risk there is that you've employed somebody and you go, yeah, we got our security bloke, he sits over there behind that door, so therefore we're okay. And if the door never opens and the security bloke sits behind it all his life, then the first you'll know about the fact that the security isn't in place is when something goes wrong.
So, Tom, summing all of this up, if you're a CEO or investor watching this podcast, what are the top 3 takeaways you'd want them to have in this conversation?
So, top 3, I would say, first of all, have you got the leadership and governance in your organization to take accountability for understanding and managing cyber risk? And the best way to test that is to find out who thinks they're accountable and find out how much they understand about the risk. Because if they can't answer that question, they won't have it. The second side of things is it's easier to start small and grow as you expand than it is to wait until you know you've got a problem and try and do everything at once. And that applies to cybersecurity, that applies to AI in the same way that it applies to pretty much everything in business. If you put things off until you know they're a problem, then the problem's going to be very large. The third thing I would suggest, it comes back to the topic of AI governance. We know that we need to be exploring how we can adopt AI. We need to get the governance right, because the technologies that we're handling here are far harder to control than technologies that we've become used to over the last few decades. And therefore, we need to get that right at the outset. Now, again, I'd end on an optimistic note, which is I see an awful lot of organizations struggling to get through proof of concept and into production with AI because they have the anxiety about, well, yeah, it looks okay, but do I really trust it? If you get the governance right, and not just the governance, but the life cycle, if you define the risks and the benefits right from the outset when you're deciding which initiatives to take forward, and you build the risk mitigations and the benefits realization into the proof of concept, into the proof of value, you've got a far higher chance of getting that initiative into production and therefore reaping the benefits. If you don't, then you'll have a really uncomfortable feeling in the pit of your stomach, which probably will mean that you'll spend lots of money on proof of concept, but never deliver the returns.
Major Tom, thank you.
Ground control. It's a pleasure.